getting more back into doing these kind of activities and some of the mentoring stuff you used to do earlier on, as I am starting to actually transition out of Xeris and been there for about 6 years, and it's time for me to move on and think of something new to do. I'll give you a little bit of my background first, and then what I thought we'd do is we would just have a bit of a free-form conversation. I have kind of touched a variety of different aspects of businesses in general, technology businesses, so I can talk about a lot of different topics. The intent of the conversation today was going to be around IP and fundraising, and I was just going to kind of poll the audience what they would prefer I talk about, because I've kind of been dealt with both of those topics in depth for both the companies that I've co-founded. Yeah, again, my name is Yash. My background is actually in optical engineering. I did my undergraduate work at the University of Rochester in optics, and I went to the University of Arizona to do my PhD in optical engineering with an emphasis on medical optics and medical imaging. After finishing my PhD, I started a company with 2 other students I was going to school with, and we decided we were going to make high-end digital imaging systems for biomedical applications. We decided to bootstrap that company, so we maxed out credit cards, kind of lived in our office, so my futon was right next to my desk for a couple of years. I was, single, I didn't have a family, young, I had nothing to lose, I just, it was a continuation of graduate school, if you will, in terms of my income level at least, if not worse actually, because my stipend went away. It was a very interesting experience to try to bootstrap a company like that. We were actually a manufacturing company, so we got to a point one day when we actually had our own CNC machines, lathes, mills, so on and so forth, because we were actually manufacturing our own product and marketing it and distributing it around the world. That was a company that we did not ever get any venture capital for, so we were clever about how we got some grants, SBIR grants. We got some subsidized loans, if you will. They were sort of city-county programs that we utilized to get some subsidized loans. And once we got to a certain level of revenue, we were actually able to just go get bank loans to fund the rest of our development. So had the company for about 8 years, and then we were acquired by Roper Industries, which is a publicly traded company. They folded us into one of their scientific imaging divisions, and I was there for about 10 months and then left. And that was my first sabbatical, which, as I was remarking to Cindy, lasted about 5 years because I met my future wife in that during that period, and she distracted me for a while until she, being from Austin, wanted to move back here, and I was ready to get back in with another opportunity. So we came to Austin, and about 6 months later, I got hooked up with one of the co-founders of Xeris. So Xeris Pharmaceuticals is a very interesting, it's actually a technology company, I would say, not really a pharmaceutical company, because we have a very novel way of making injectable drugs that get rid of a lot of the issues around refrigeration or reconstitution at the time of use. A lot of benefits to the technology. The company at the time was really only the two scientific co-founders, and they really needed somebody to come in to pull the business proposition together, help raise money, and actually build the infrastructure around the company. So even though I didn't have a pharma background, John, the CEO at the time, asked me to come on board, and he was still in Northern California looking for a place to move the company. I said, sure, I'll come on board. We got to move the company to Austin. And he said, sure. So he came here. I started working with him in 2010 and sat down and really started understanding what the value proposition was and building the story around it. We then went out, raised about $1.5 million, half of it was led by CTAM, so Central Texas Angel Network, here in Austin. That then went into a convertible note round that we did. That was a bigger round, and then converted into a Series B round. We've gotten lots of SBIR grants. We were an ETF recipient back in 2012. Xeris was trying to get started at a time when funding especially for pharma and biotech, was virtually non-existent. And it's a very different environment today where there's a lot more venture capital interested in investing. Back then, early stage, Series A, almost nobody was touching biotech and pharmaceuticals. So we had to be very clever about how we built the company. So I was COO and CFO for about 4 years, and then after we finished the B round, which was an $18 million round, I recruited a CFO to give him that role, and I focused on my COO role, which is now heavily sort of pharmaceutical manufacturing operations, if you will. And in December of 2015, we closed a $41 million C round, and so the company is now sort of well-funded, sort of its own living, breathing entity, and so I feel comfortable kind of moving on and taking a break and thinking about what I'm going to do next. So we're about 20 people. So when I started, it was the 2 co-founders and me, and we were still working out of our homes. And now we're about 20 people. We have office space right over here, 32nd and Red River with our R&D labs. We've got about 3 or 4 products in the pipeline. So it's been a pretty interesting experience to watch it grow. Now there's people that are walking around and like, who are you? I didn't hire you. Who are you? So it's kind of interesting to see that. So with that said, like I mentioned earlier, I have sort of touched a lot of different aspects of business. I'm willing to answer whatever question I can. If I don't know, I'll say I don't know.
Are you going to need to raise more money for
sure? I think it depends now what the team and the board are going to do as far as the strategy going forward. So I think if they're going to take the company public, then yes, there will be more fundraising going on to build the demand for the IPO ultimately. But they may also decide to just hit a couple more milestones and then license the current product, the new product, or sell it or whatever. So in that case, we probably wouldn't need to. So it's really a question of whether we're going to commercialize ourselves or to hand it off to a bigger partner after we've taken most of the risk off the table for them. So yeah, interesting question. I don't know. I'm not going to be around to answer that one.
but you'll still care.
Yes, I'm still a significant stockholder of the company, so I will care, absolutely. So, I can talk about IP. Jay mentioned that, so I'm mentoring Sector Medical. Mitch is here. They're one of the ATI SEAL companies this year. He's been really doing an outstanding job of really kind of digging in. And I think as he digs in, he's really starting to understand the complexity and the sort of the day-to-day roller coaster that is, emotional roller coaster that is building your own technology company. I had a meeting with him and his team a couple weeks ago. We talked a lot about IP strategy because for medical device companies like Scepter, that's a critical piece. If you don't have a strong IP portfolio, that's something you have to think about. If you're going to continue moving forward or not, are the other aspects of your business model strong enough to make up for the weakness if there is one there? So things like that. So we talked about that. I can go into a little bit about IP if that's interesting for people, or I can focus on fundraising because I have been through A rounds, convertible note rounds, B rounds, debt financing, you name it.
That would be helpful.
Fundraising? Okay. So I think I'm just gonna kind of talk a little bit freeform here. So there are, I think to start at the beginning, there's sort of 2 types of financing. There's debt financing and there's equity financing. And I'll just talk a little bit about it in case you don't know what they really are. So debt financing is going to the bank and getting a loan. Or somebody gives you a loan, you're paying an interest rate, and when the loan comes, when it matures, you need to pay them back their money. Okay? If you don't pay them back their money, they are first in line to take whatever they want, shut you down, take your assets, sell your assets, do whatever they need to do to recover their money. Okay? Equity is selling the stock in your company. So at that point, you're selling people stock in their company. When you get the cash, it's your cash. And when you run out of cash, you don't have to pay them back. But if you don't have any more cash, then you're going to have to close your doors, and then they are again they're in line, but they're second in line if you've also raised debt. Okay, so obviously with early stage companies, debt is something very difficult to get because you don't have any way to service the debt and you don't have any assets to collateralize the debt. Okay, so generally you're doing equity raising. There is a hybrid in between called a convertible note, which is something that people will utilize. And so a convertible note has elements of both. It's like a loan to begin with, and then it converts into equity based on a certain kind of trigger, right? And usually that trigger is the raising of an equity round. So one of the reasons people do this in between type of vehicle is that in the early stages, it's very difficult to come to an agreement on what the valuation of the company is often. So entrepreneurs like to think that what they have is a lot more valuable than what investors like to think you have. And sometimes that gulf is really wide. And so one of the ways you can try to bridge that is to say, okay, well, you give me a loan, and when I convert this, when I get a equity round in the future, then all the money that you gave me will convert into shares, but I'll give you a discount because that's sort of the carrot for investing when I was earlier stage and giving me a chance to get some milestones done that then allowed me to get the equity investment. So in the beginning, the convertible note is structured very much like a loan. It's an interest rate. There's a maturity date. And again, if you don't actually get the conversion done by the maturity date, then it's still like a loan, and you're effectively defaulting on a loan. So the only thing that's nice is that when you convert to equity, you don't have to pay them back the cash. Their cash that they gave you converts into shares, so that's kind of a nice feature of that because you're not generating cash usually. So those are kind of the three structures. If you have any questions about that? Yeah.
So you could also pay out in cash if you choose to, right?
You could, but you wouldn't want to do that because if you were going to do that, you would have just done the loan, right? And actually, it's not usually your option to pay out the cash. It's the person who gave you the note. It's their option whether they want to take the cash or they want to convert the shares to equity. So they may, if you're doing really well, they may say, well, I actually want shares in your company. I don't want you to pay me back. So you can. Those are things you can negotiate at the time of the note. But generally, I think the shareholder, if I were giving you a convertible note, I would want that option to decide, not give you the option to decide.
How do grants play into this?
So grants are what you call non-dilutive funding, right? So dilution refers to the idea that when you sell shares in your company, your percentage ownership goes down, right? So non-dilutive funding is the idea that you can get grant money or money that's not a loan. You're not selling shares in the company. You basically don't have to pay the money back, right? So it's quote unquote free money, but we'll talk about how free it actually is. And that's a great way to fund, especially early stage companies that are still high risk in the technology space. So a perfect example of a grant program is the SBIR program, the Small Business Innovation Research Grant Program that the federal government has. Every federal agency that has a R&D budget is required to set aside a certain portion of their budget for funding SBIR grants. We did a panel discussion on SBIR grants a little while back, so SBIR grants have become very popular, as have other foundation grants. So for example, Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has gotten more involved with actually funding programs, but also requesting some kind of return on that. So they've been kind of now hybridizing the grant equity model, if you will. So these kinds of hybridizations are coming in. We received grants from the Helmsley Trust, and in their scenario, they get some very, very small royalty on sales if we commercialize the product, right? Things like that. So those kind of things are happening, but for the most part, this is money that you don't have to pay back and you don't have to convert into shares. So you're maintaining your ownership. And if for some reason, things just kind of wash out and it didn't work or you ran out of cash, you don't owe them anything back. So you can keep going as long as you get more money, right? So SBIR grants are an excellent vehicle for funding your company early on, especially when you're doing technology work. They are very challenging to get because, especially as venture capital firms kind of went away from early stage funding, everybody was flocking to the SBIR program. So it's kind of like trying to get into medical school, right? Every 3,000, 4,000 applications, you're only taking 30 people. You have a lot of people trying to get SBIR grants, and it's not as simple as just writing a good grant and thinking you're going to get funded, right? So, Mitch, go ahead.
How do you think you stand out in the grant application?
Yeah. So, well, the way you have to stand, there's a number of ways to stand out. One of the key ones is understanding how the NIH process works. The SBIR, or whichever agency, whether it's NIH or DoD or DOE or NSF, they all have SBIR programs. Understanding how their process works, talking to their program managers to understand what are their priorities. So each agency has priorities that they have selected for their agency. So in the case of NIDDK, which is Diabetes NIH Institute for Diabetes, they have specific priorities within NIH that they want to accelerate or focus on. And so it's good if what you're doing aligns with their priorities. So the best way to find that out is to talk to an SBIR program manager there to see if that alignment exists, right? The next thing to do is to get a person to collaborate with you on the grant that the people at NIH know very well and is very well respected. So that's one of the tools we've used very effectively. We have used in the diabetes space, we have collaborated with diabetes clinicians who are sort of award-winning, top of their class, that when their name is said, everybody knows who they're talking, who's being spoken about, and if they're vouching for your effort, that means a big deal within the group that's going to be reviewing it. So those are some of the key, and then of course you have to write a technically strong grant. So writing things that are backed up by data and good scientific rationale, not a lot of conjecturing around what might happen, what could happen, and so on and so forth. Building a strong case for it.
Yeah, and if you're interested in more, we have notes compiled from the SBIR panel that Yash referred to. It's on Slack. If you want to read more on the notes about that, it's up there.
Any other questions yet?
Sure. So, coming from the business side and working with founders that are more highly technical, how do you balance, or did you run into any issues balancing the furthering of the science versus the commercialization of going further?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. I think I felt like one of my strengths always has been the ability to translate between the two worlds. I come from an engineering background, engineering discipline, but I've operated the business side for a while. I kind of can do that translation. But you're right, there's often a disconnect there where the science people want the money to advance the science. The business people are saying, no, we need to advance the business. And so what you have to do then is sit down and really understand. I mean, it's good product development means that you start with the customer or the end user in mind and work your way backwards. And so the key challenge here is that a lot of times the scientists and the engineers are looking at what they have right now and how to move that forward instead of looking at what the end goal is and how to get there, right? So that's a good way as a business person is to keep refocusing the conversation on, hey, what is it that we need to do for our customer? What price are they willing to pay? That means we need to make it for this much. And so you as the R&D team or the product development team need to figure out a way to make this product that's going to cost this much when we make it at this scale, right? And you just have to keep refocusing that conversation because the bottom line is that if you can't make it for less than you can sell it, you don't have a business. And a lot of times the scientists and the engineers kind of forget that. So I can go a little bit more. So for a lot of you who may be early stage, let's talk a little about the convertible note. Okay, the convertible note, again, like I said, is a loan, right? So I'll give you an example. So with Xeris, after we did our A round, and we were doing some product development work, we realized that we needed to have, there were a few more things that we needed to do that weren't anticipated. And so the question though was, if we went out and did another equity round at that point in time, we were not going to get the kind of valuation that we wanted, and so we were going to end up, giving away a big chunk of the company in order to get that money. So what we decided to do was to do a convertible note round after the A round, and so we got approval from our board to do X $1 million convertible note round. And so we went out to investors and pitched it, and so the two big pieces or three big pieces are, what's the interest rate, right? And the next big piece is you're going to offer a discount to these people, and what that means is that at some point you're going to need to do an equity round. So say that so when we did an A round, had a convertible note, so the next round is going to be B. At the B round, say we're going to sell shares for $2 a share, right? And we have told these convertible note people they're going to get a 20% discount. Okay, what that means is that they're going to get shares at anyone?
$1.60.
$1.60, right? So if they had given you $10,000, and let's forget about the interest that's accrued over, right? Then instead of getting 5,000 shares, because they're getting it $2 a share, they're going to get more. They're going to get a little over 6,000 shares because of the discount that they get. That's their reward for giving you loans, right? Now, what also happens though is that interest accrues. So if it was 8% and it was a year, then they're actually going to get $10,800 divided by $1.60 to get the number of shares. So you can see the longer the note, the maturity, the more interest you let accrue, it's sort of diluted that way, and that you end up giving away more of the company. Obviously, the bigger the discount, you end up giving away more of the company. And what you also have to understand is that if you give too big of a discount, the next group of investors is going to be not so excited about it because they're saying, wait a minute, we're paying $2 a share. And it's one thing if you were going to go raise, if you're raising $10 million and your convertible note round is only $500,000, that's such a big difference. $500,000 is not that big of a deal. If you're going to go do another $500,000 B round and you have a $500,000 note sitting out there at a 50% discount, these B round guys are going to say, wait a minute, we don't like that. Then you have to go back and renegotiate with your convertible note holders to take less of a discount, and then that's when everything goes haywire. So you got to think about what's coming up in the future and not just focus on what's going on today, because you could put yourself into a box based on what you've done today and not be able to get yourself stuck in the future.
So, are there limitations or any types of restrictions? So, say I had a convertible note, I lent out money to a startup at like a 50% discount, which is pretty high. But and I sold the shares automatically to another company for less than what is selling at a public.
Right, so that's a really good question. Yeah, so a couple things. One is that when you do the convertible note, you don't actually have the shares yet. It's still a loan. So it doesn't convert into shares until the next equity round happens. So you're kind of stuck as the investor. You have to wait until the next round happens, right? So as an investor, you have to think, this is still a loan, right? Because if they don't ever get to that next round, I may never get my money back, right? So, and then the other thing is that generally in these types of, whether it's convertible notes or A rounds or B rounds, you are usually locked up and you cannot sell your shares, okay? You have to hold the shares generally until the company is sold or until there's an IPO, right? And even then you have to wait 6 months for you to sell your shares. So the other thing you have to know as an investor If you're putting money in, once it's in, it's kind of in, and you got to be ready to hold it for the long term. And then, of course, long term will depend on what the nature of the business is. So, a software business long term is very different than pharma biotech business. You know, it could be 3 years versus 10 years. So.
And once it matures, you're free to sell it at any rate you want, even if it's below what the company is offering.
No, once it matures, and you haven't paid it back, then all those investors now effectively own your company.
No, I mean, sorry, from the investor's point of view, once the shares that you, you invested in, you, gave out a convertible note, your shares converted, now you own them, and you bought them at a discount, so
Right.
they're actually the same value as the shares that are being offered by the company, just at you got them at a lower rate. Can you still sell them at
Generally not.
No.
But it's not a public market. It's private, and they want all the shareholders want everybody to be in it together for the long haul. So you don't end up with everything falling apart because some people try to sell their shares and I want to sell my shares. And,
Yeah,
it's called the right of first refusal. So.
thanks.
Is the conversion on the note, is that typically forced by the equity round, or is it at the option of the investor? Can they continue? Can they elect to not convert? In most scenarios?
No, generally it is forced by the equity round.
As a startup, if you get a convertible note, is it standard to prevent them from revolving their debt before you reach the equity round?
Yeah. Usually there'll be provisions that they can't recall it. I think unless you do something bad, right? So there's some sort of fraud or negligence, something like that, and that can trigger it. But generally, you don't want them to be able to recall. You also have to remember that it's not in their interest. So say you get $1 million note or $5,000 note, and you're spending money, right? And then, trying to recall a note from a company that doesn't have any money, it's like trying to get blood from a stone. What's the point? You're just going to torpedo the company. So, generally, they're not going to do that unless they just want to kill the company, which doesn't make any sense. But they're definitely not going to get their money back. So, So let's move on to equity instruments, okay? So once you get to equity, things start to get a lot more complicated. And the reason is that because it's not a straightforward loan with interest rate, blah, 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 investors still like to try to put provisions in there that sort of make it mimic at some level a loan, right? So what starts to happen when you have an equity investment is first you have to figure out, well, what's the value of the company, right? So if you're going to, if you think about it, selling shares in your company with a pre-money valuation of $1 million, right? So pre-money means what's the value before you actually sell the shares, right? If I have a pre-money valuation of a company of $1 million and I do a $500,000 equity round, so I get $500,000 of cash, then the post-money is going to be $1.5 million, right? So, so the difference between a $1 million pre-money and a $2 million pre-money is a huge difference, right? Think about the amount of ownership you're giving away, right? It's a big, big difference. So, really understanding and trying to maximize your pre-money is important. So that's one of the aspects. The next thing that'll come in is they want generally to put in some sort of requirement that they can get dividends, right? Now, company can't pay dividends if they don't have any cash, but they can certainly accrue dividends, right? So it's something that people kind of forget sometimes is that, dividends can accrue if they are, so there's a phrase in there that'll say cumulative. The dividends are cumulative, but they can kind of, build up over time, right? That is a mechanism that venture capitalists will use that can have significant effects on your dilution because if the dividends are accruing for 1 year, it's probably fine. But if you had a hiccup and now you are still going for another 5 years, now you can start to see how if it's an 8%, say it's 8%, and then 8%, and then 8%, and then 8%. So it's a mechanism that can really start to destroy your ownership. Something that I was very cognizant of with Xeris and made sure that we negotiate a non-cumulative dividend structure if and when approved by the board. So, the board has to first say that we're going to start doing these dividends, and even if they do, it's not going to accumulate. It's just going to be, well, we do it for that year or we don't. And if we don't do it, then it resets, right? Way to preserve ownership. There's a lot of other provisions that I won't get into right now. That's probably a class all in itself in terms of. So one of the big ones also is liquidation preferences. So what that means is that this is again sort of a debt style term working its way into equity, and what that generally means is that the investors get their money back before you get to divide the spoils of whatever result or success you may have had as a company. So an example is if you got $1 million investment from people and they had a 1x liquidation preference, right? And so what I'm going to explain is what they call a fully participating liquidation preference. Then say you sell the company down the line for $5 million, right? They're going to get their $1 million back first, and then you will split the balance of the $4 million based on what everybody's ownership is, right? So effectively that means they actually have more ownership than you think, right? So there are 1x, there are 2, sometimes people try to do multiples on liquidation preferences. One of the ways to avoid that is to do what's called a non-participating liquidation preference. So in that situation, if you sell the company for $5 million, these people that put in $1 million, they get to choose whether they get their $1 million back or you split the full $5 million amongst people in terms of their ownership, right? So that's that's a more preferable way for you as the entrepreneur because where these liquidation preferences start to become really problematic is when you have raised large amounts of capital. So at Xeris, we have raised probably $60 million in private capital, right? So if you look, and so think about if we were to sell the company, say for $120 million, and we had a 1x fully participating, well, out of that $120 million, 60 would first go back to the investors, and then the balance of the 60 would be shared amongst all the investors. So that's a huge hit to all the common stockholders because that first 60 went, right? If you had a non-participating 1x, then they could either take the 60 or they could share amongst everybody the 120 that was the final selling price. So these are things that start to become important, and there's a lot of interrelationships between the terms of a term sheet for equity investing that you have to really, really think about, and you have to kind of plan out, scenario planning. Go, what happens if I go this way? What if I don't get my license and have to raise more money? What if I can't sell the company in 3 years and I end up holding it for 6 years and have to raise more money? All these you want to plan all that out or think about it at least so you have a sense of how are the things you're agreeing to today going to impact you later on, because what you set today as terms, say for a Series A round, are the same terms. You can't give worse terms to the B round and the C round people. They won't take it. They may try to take better terms than your A round, the previous rounds, but they certainly won't take worse. So what you do early on kind of gets cast in stone, and you're stuck with that going forward. Any questions? The equity raising is a daunting experience, very humbling experience too. Because you think you know what you're doing, and you think whatever you got is so great, and then everybody says no, it isn't. They say, "You sure you want to do that? Why would you do that? That's crazy." Yes.
With respect to saying one of the mentors, one of the questions I get asked a lot when I mentor entrepreneurs is how important is it to maintain majority ownership position? So if we would take the limited preference scenario, would you take that plus a 65% ownership as the founder, or would you get rid of the limited preference and go?
That's a very good question. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And actually, you can, I actually did these calculations. You can actually calculate how the liquidation preference affects the actual ownership, right? The other thing that I think everybody has to remember is that even if a group of investors comes in and actually purchases less than 50% of the company, they still will have control provisions within the terms of the offering that usually give them either control or allow them to block via their board representation, right? So one of the ways that will happen is they'll say, okay, well, you know what, we're putting this money in. We want a 5-person board. We want 2 seats of the board, and nothing can happen unless it's unanimous consent or at least 4 of the 5 board members approve it, right? So that way they can block because they've got 2 people, right? And one may vote for it, and if one votes against it, it's not going anywhere, right? And this is usually for any kind of major event that's going to happen, whether it's any additional offering, any sale of the company, any major license agreement, anything that's going to be a major event for the company. The investors will control it through their board control. So that's kind of one of the ways they get around the issues of actual percentage ownership.
We had a company at ATI a few years ago. So the founders put in a couple $100,000. They got a VC to put in $1.5 to $2 million. About a year later, they got an offer for $28 million to buy the company. The VCs walked in. All the founders and employees wanted to take it. They were all multi-millionaires by lots. VC said no. They want more money. It happens more.
Yeah.
What happened at the store?
Yes.
What was the question?
Are they still around?
Oh, okay.
How long did your Series A
That's also another very good question. So generally, anything under $1 million starts to take a while, right, to close a full round. You're probably talking about anywhere from 6 to 12 months to get a $1 million round closed. More like 9 to 12 months. A lot of it also depends, though, on so there's a seasonality to investing too that you have to understand. So we unfortunately kind of got stuck into this cycle of every time we were starting to raise money, it was around March, April, which is not a good time because by the time you get everything pulled together, you get people to approve the round, the existing investors, now you're heading into May and June. And guess what? All the rich people in the summertime don't want to think about investing. They're in Montana, they're in Colorado, they're in Europe, they're wherever they are, having a good time, and they're not going to do anything until October, generally, right? So that is a window you don't want to hit, right? So the best time to start preparing for your round is October, November. Get everything ready, approved in December, and then hit it in January when everybody comes back from vacation and the holidays, and they're ready to, do what's next. At that point, you've got a 3 to 4 month, 5 month window to get everything done, pitched, done, closed, because then you're in the summer again. So you really only have about 6 to 7 months every year to raise money, and it's important that you know that, because as hard as I tried to break us out of that cycle, we just got stuck in it somehow, and it was hard to do it. So, because the problem is you go, okay, yeah, we just close that, and we don't want to get stuck in that summer cycle again, so we should then raise another round now. But people go, well, you just raised money. Why are you gonna raise money again? And I'm not gonna give you a 2x valuation on what you just raised. It's only been 2 months or 3 months, so that's why you kind of get stuck in this in this situation. You know, there's a lot of balancing that goes on when you're doing equity investing because you don't want to take too little money, you don't want to take too much money. You need to balance it out with your milestones and raising money when you actually have generated value by completing certain milestones, things like that. So there's a lot of just kind of strategic planning involved. Yes.
So regarding the time to close or any other factors regarding closing around, do you think it's dependent upon the industry vertical you're in, or Cal, of course, you're raising larger amounts of money per round on average? Do you have any sense on that?
Oh, absolutely. It is absolutely depends on the vertical that you're in. So in the pharma biotech vertical, you are having people that are going to do deep dives on your IP, which is not the case on the software side. You have people that are going to do deep dives on the science behind it, which is not the case on the software side. And they are going to do some work on the market validation, but generally, you're talking about, something either is kind of compelling or it isn't, and you can have key opinion leaders speak to it, as opposed to, other groups where we have to kind of get out there and do larger populations of surveying to get a sense of how things are going to play in the market. So it absolutely does. But on the flip side, you have a lot more protection in say the pharma biotech space because you have IP. If you get your product approved, you usually have a certain number of years of exclusivity where nobody can do what you're doing. So there are built-in, sort of safeguards and markets and things on that side that you then don't have on the software side because anybody can come in and try to compete with what you're doing on that side. So it definitely does, and you need to understand what that is, what your vertical is, as you invest, as you pitch. The other thing that we were very good at in terms of helping us raise money is having our stuff in order when we went to investors. So, one of the things that I did when I first came into Xeris was I cleaned up a lot of the legal stuff. I restructured the cap table. I did a lot of things that when we actually then went out to investors, it was a very clean story, and people weren't looking at it going, "Why is this such a mess?" So a lot of times, people who go out to raise money don't understand that you can't have a confusing cap table, and you can't have a situation where there's a lot of gaps in your legal documents. You shouldn't have employees hired that have not assigned their rights to the company for whatever they develop while in your employ. Things like that. Things that can kind of make IP issues and other things very confusing going forward and provide a risk where an employee can come back and say, well, that was my idea, and I never assigned it to the company, so I should get something for it. Those are kind of things that you don't want to happen later on, and investors, especially sophisticated investors, will catch all of that stuff. So having good counsel to help you pull all that together before you go out is well worth it, and I would highly recommend that you do that. Bart?
You kind of glossed over cleaning up the cap table.
Yeah.
That's usually not a fun process.
Yes.
What does that actually mean?
Well, okay, so I'll give you an example of Xeris. So when I came on board, there were actually 3 founders of Xeris. But one of the founders, and Xeris had started in 2005, and I came on in 2010. So what were they doing for 5 years? Well, the 3 founders all kind of had day jobs, and they had created Xeris as sort of an entity just to hold some IP that they were buying back at pennies on the dollar that one of the other founders had generated. Well, it was a different company. So they did that, and they just kind of held it for a couple of years. And one of the guys said, okay, he was going to take a severance package and kind of be CEO for this company. That was 2007, 2008, when everything crashed, and you couldn't raise any money at all for anything. So he just kind of kept it going with his own personal funds, kind of limping along until they won an SBIR grant. So anyway, in that whole interim, one of the guys who had sort of initially been a founder just wasn't active in the company anymore, but he owned 33% of the company, right? So when I came on board and I said, well, look, first of all, you have issued, they had issued like 5 million shares to each, or something like that, 1 million or 5 million shares to each person. And you go, what does it matter? A couple percentages anyway. Well, no, it does matter because if you want to issue more shares, say you want to bring somebody else in who wants to become a 25% owner, you got to issue another 5 million shares. Now you got 20 million shares. Well, you don't want a huge share base because that causes problems for you later on, which we won't get into now. So anyway, they had this issue. They had a founder who wasn't active anymore, and one of my requirements for coming on board was I wanted a significant stake in the company because there wasn't going to be any salary for me to begin with. So I was putting a lot of risk on the line. So what we had to do was we had to, one of the founders had to talk to the other founder and say, look, we're going to do a reverse split of the company. So this is where, if there's 1 million shares outstanding and you do a 10-to-1 reverse split, everybody gets 1/10 of the shares that they had. All the percentages of ownership stay the same, but the number of shares that everybody owns goes down. Then you reauthorize a pool of shares, and then you can start distributing more shares out to people again. That's kind of how you restructure it. So I said, look, you have to tell this other person that he hasn't been active for 3 years in the company. He can't retain 33% ownership of the company, especially if he's not going to do anything going forward, right? So that was a tough conversation for him to have with that person, but they worked through it, and then we did a 20-to-1 reverse split. So we took, all those shares and crunched them back down into a smaller base. Then we started to authorize the number of shares appropriately, because in any investment, the investors coming in will say, well, look, we're putting in this much money, and if that amounts to 900,000 shares, we want you to authorize 1 million. Because that means you can only issue another 100,000 over what, we have. Because we have this control provision that you can't issue more shares unless we say so. So we're not going to let you have 5 million shares authorized, because you can just start handing out the other 4 million and we get way diluted, right? So hopefully that answers your question, but it's basically rejiggering kind of the number of shares without affecting the ownership, at least in that rejiggering, and then you start affecting the ownership by issuing new shares, and that's a function of who's coming in, who's going to be working for the company, who's investing, so on and so forth. So did that answer the question?
It's a shockingly painful conversation to have. Yeah. A lot of times you're forcing early investors to sell out as well.
Right.
And that's a really tough one to do.
Yeah.
So what's the messaging with early investors? What's the...
Do this or you don't get anything.
What's that?
Do this or you don't get anything.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunately it's a stick of a message. There's no carrots here. It's a stick, and it's not a, that's why proper planning up front is important. Vetting your other partners that you may be going into business with is important, because, somebody may have 25% of the company and then they don't do anything, and you can't do anything about it, right? So one of the ways you deal with that is vesting schedules for shares, so that every year they get more and more ownership. That way, if they bag out after 6 months or 1 year, they only got a small sliver of shares. They don't own such a big chunk. What didn't last returns back to the pool to be given to somebody else.
What gave that 33% original founder? Were they zeroed out, or were they given some sort of small token percentage?
Well, no. So what happened was that when we did the reverse split, those 3 founders all still owned 33% of the company, right? But then what we did is the 2 founders that were going to continue, they got issued new shares. So the other guy got diluted, and then I got shares because I was coming on board, so he got further diluted. So that's how he gets diluted, where other people kind of maintain their share or keep higher share in the company. You first scrunch it down, and then you start to individually pump people back up, if you will, in their ownership by giving restricted stock.
Well, just to be respectful of everyone's time, it is 1 o'clock.
Okay.
I mean, we do have this room for as long as we need it. If anyone wants to hang around, talk, eat more, if you still want to.
I got 2 more minutes, and then I gotta I'm going to meet with Mitch back in my office, actually. So. He's going to tell me about his pricing model.
No, well, thank you, Yash, for doing this. It was very helpful.
Good thing.